So my name is Lennart Olsson, and I come from Lund University in Sweden. But I also represent the Land Institute in Kansas, in the United States, which is the intellectual hub of breeding perennial, the future perennial crops. So I'm going to talk about the prospects of a perennial future of agriculture. Let me start with a fairy tale style. Once upon a time, let's say 10,000, 12,000 years ago, people started to collect seeds in the environment and eating seeds. And they found the seeds were good. And they saved the bigger seeds for the next season to plant them. Over thousands of years, this has given us the cereals that we still depend on. To something like 70%. 70% of our food comes from annual crops, and they were domesticated thousands of years ago. In hindsight, we can probably say that it was a mistake to domesticate annuals. It would have been better if they had domesticated perennials. But I don't think they had the opportunity to do so. It would have probably been impossible for them to do so. So no blame on them. But now, when the food system is at a very serious crossroad, and we have the scientific knowledge to restart the Neolithic revolution, we should go for perennial grains rather than tweaking the 1,000-year-old crops that we have. The person who coined the perennial vision, he might not have been the first in the world, but the one who is driving or was driving the process now was Wes Jackson, who established the Land Institute in the 1970s, and he outlined his vision for a perennial future in agriculture in a book in 1980, New Roots for Agriculture. And his idea was that we should look at the natural system as some kind of a measure, because the natural ecosystem is usually sustainable. So what are the most important functions from a natural ecosystem that we should try to have in our agricultural system? And he came down to two very important principles. We should have mainly perennial crops. They have deep, large root systems. And we should have diversity in space. I mean, in agriculture, we have lots of diversity. We want to have diversity, but we most often have it over time. We have crop rotations. But from an ecological point of view, it is probably much better to have the diversity in space. So back in the 1980s, most people laughed at Wes Jackson, I think. Nowadays, I don't think many laugh at him any longer. So let's now think about some of the problems of agriculture. And I would like you to think carefully about what is the root cause of each problem that I will outline here. The first problem is erosion. Conventional agriculture, we have soil erosion that is 20 to 100 times faster than the natural regeneration of soils. It's no rocket science to say that this is unsustainable. And what is the root cause of high erosion? That we use annuals that needs to be replanted every year. We need to do a lot of tillage in this on soil. Nutrients. Every conventional system is losing something like 50% of its nitrogen and lots of its phosphorus that we add. What is the root cause of this extreme inefficiency of nutrient circulation in our agricultural systems? The use of annuals. Compared to a natural system, natural soil, we have lost 40 to 70% of the soil carbon through agriculture, through tillage, and through using very shallow-rooted crops, annuals. We have lots of problems of weeds, and weeds is a problem in itself, but perhaps the management of weeds is an even bigger problem, which I will come to later. And the reason why we have so much weeds problems is primarily because of annual crops. And we have a very energy-consuming and time-consuming way of growing things on our fields, and the root cause is animals. If we look at the economics of agriculture, I don't think I have to convince many of you here that the hourly salary of a farmer is very, very low. So if we look at here, the thick green line here, this is from the United States. The thick green line here shows the relative price of the produce, so the payment that farmers get for their produce, their food grains. It has been more or less stable over time since 1980, or even going down a bit. But look at the inputs, the seeds, the fertilizer, the agrochemicals. And of course, this was drawn before the skyrocketing of mineral fertilizers. But this widening gap is, of course, a real problem. And what drives up the costs of the agriculture inputs is, of course, our annual system needs all these inputs. If we look further into the future, let's say towards the end of this century, most climate scientists say that the existing crops will face unprecedented challenges in terms of climate. So we actually need to reinvent many of our crops. And as I will show later, most of the crops we already have, they don't have the genetic diversity that we need in order to develop them further. They have reached some kind of a plateau. So a perennial revolution, is it desirable, viable, and achievable? Desirable for whom and for what? It is definitely desirable for farmers. Which farmer wouldn't like a crop that you planted one season and then you harvested over and over again with a minimum of management? Somebody said that it's perhaps the farmer's dream, but Monsanto's nightmare. There was a farmer in Kansas who said so. Because it means that we would more or less make the seed industry superfluous. And agrochemical, at least in terms of herbicide industry, superfluous. Viable, would it work indefinitely without negative side effects? We hope so, but there is, of course, a lot of research that needs to be done in order to look very carefully into this in a sort of multi-decade perspective. And achievable, what would it take to make it happen? I will concentrate on the last one here. So first of all, what are the candidate crops that can become our mainstay of food in the future? So here we have pictures we have upper left, we have perennial sorghum, we have perennial barley, we have silphium, which is a version of sunflower that is perennial. We have rice. And the big one in the middle is kernza, intermediate wheatgrass. I will talk more about that one. We have perennial wheat. We have sainfoin, which is a very promising legume, like lentils, more or less, that is now bred to become a food crop. And to the right, bottom right, we have pigeon pea, which is extremely important tropical legume. Here is a graph that many of you might have seen on the internet. But I think we should take a look at this picture. I would have loved to bring it into the field and show it, but I will at least show the original in scale 1:1. And I need some help here. David, you can help, you are tall. Can I get two more people to come up here and help me displaying this let me see, this poster? I get one person here. Can I get another person here? No. Even you are too short to show that way. We have to do it like this. So, and one in the middle here. So if you stand here, and you stand at the end. Okay, so here I'm showing, maybe we move over here, don't fall off, like that. Okay, so at the top here is intermediate wheatgrass, which is the latest domesticated cereal. It's probably 4,000 years since we had another cereals that was domesticated. And up here is a comparison with winter wheat. So this is to show the root And then we need somebody here to hold like that. Yes. Okay. So what we show here is Kernza, or intermediate wheatgrass, that has been grown in a big tube that can be sort of put down into the soil and then lifted up. So that's why the root system is so concentrated. Normally it would be much wider, but as deep. And you compare it with spring wheat. So the spring wheat here, winter wheat, is ready to be harvested. The roots will disappear and it will start producing new roots next season. Kernza here will just accumulate. This is the second season of Kernza. We just continue accumulating root biomass. So experiments have shown that the root biomass here is something like 15 up to 20 times as big as the winter wheat root biomass. So we can put it down and then perhaps thank you very much for the help. And we can, if somebody's interested, you can take a look at it afterwards. I will just give you a very, very short crash course on ecology. What does ecological theory say about the benefits of perennials over annuals? I could draw on many ecological theories, but I choose the, since we are in the UK, John Grime, who passed away recently, sort of a very influential ecologist, one of the most important theorists. He theorized that there are 3 types of plants out there in the wild, and they can be placed in these 3 corners. You have the competitive type of plant that is very good at outcompeting everybody else. Like an oak tree, it spreads the branches and take all the light from others and prevents competition. In the lower left corner, you have the stress-tolerant type of plant. And here illustrated by a cactus. And cacti are, of course, phenomenal in tolerating stress, and moisture stress in this case, using the very special way of photosynthesis. And in the bottom right corner, we have what he called the rudros, or the plants that have one particular advantage, and that is to very, very rapidly establish themselves, produce some seeds in order to live through the next generation when there has been some kind of disturbance. So, for example, in nature, we have disturbances, landslides, we have fires, perhaps. But from that point of view, nothing is more sort of stressed ecosystem than an agricultural field, where we have sort of a plowed every year. And all of our, so this is from John Grime's original paper from 1977, I think, where he placed the different types of plants. So in the upper left here, in the red circle, that is where the bottom right corner, that's the annual herbs. That's where all of our grain crops are. They are very, very specialized on producing under low competition and low stress. But on the upper right, the green circle, that's the perennial herbs. They have a much wider capacity of having sort of both stress tolerance, being competitive, and also providing sort of good under disturbed conditions. So there's a very good ecological theory why perennial plants would be much better. And if you look at a natural ecosystem, how many annual plants would you find? Very few. Maybe 5–10% of the plants in a natural ecosystem would be annuals. It's only through agriculture we have made annual plants so abundant in the world. And if we look at carbon, because we have sort of been a bit carbon obsessed in the recent decades. So if we look at what edicovariants say about the carbon budget, I won't go into detail what edicovariance means, because that will take too much time. But if we compare annual wheat with Kernza, this crop I showed here, annual wheat is often a carbon source, at least when conventionally grown. It is a source up to 6.5 to 8 tons of CO2 per hectare a year, or close to neutral in no-till. So no-till is really improvement. But compare with Kernza, it's a sink of up to 13.5 tons per hectare in year. So it's a massive difference in the amount of carbon it can store. And of course, the root system, that's the... I will not talk about this because it takes too long, and I hope you're already convinced that perennials are good. So I don't, if I have to, I will give you more sort of arguments for it. But what is the progress so far in developing new perennial grain crops? First, let's take a look at some of the results of breeding. Here we show at the top, we have tomato. It took about 7,000 years to go from the left to the right. It's very hard to see that there is any significance. Plant breeding can do a lot to changing a plant, but it takes time, long time. And at the bottom we have maize. That took about 9,000 years to go from the natural origin to what we have today. When Wes Jackson first started, when he wrote his book in 1980 and outlined the perennial revolution, he said, this will probably take at least 50 years, but I think we can do it in less than 100 years, which is a very short time, of course, in the history since the Neolithic Revolution 10,000 years ago. And now, that was 1980, he said so, now we can say that it is much, much, much closer to 50, perhaps even 40 from 1980 than 100 years. So there are two approaches, and here is, I'm mainly relying on the work done by the Land Institute, but I will show you later that it isn't just one place in the world. There is a growing movement for this. So the two approaches, one is what we call de novo domestication. That means taking a wild plant, perennial, and trying to breed it to improve its yield and other desirable traits. Or the second approach is what we call wide hybridization, to take an existing, already domesticated plant and cross it with a wild relative that is perennial. So here are some of the candidates again. To the left, we have intermediate wheatgrass, or Kernza, as I showed you. That is an example of de novo domestication. The next one is sorghum, which is an example of wide hybridization. So sorghum that was domesticated from the Sahel region in Africa has been crossed with a wide relative called Johnson grass, which some may recognize as a very, very bad weed. But that is a possibility to make sort of a high-yielding perennial sorghum. In the middle, we have silphium. That is a de novo domestication. Sainfoin as well. And at the right, we have perennial wheat, which is a wide hybridization as well. So in the future, I think we can see the whole spectrum of de novo domestication of completely new crops and a perennialization of some of the crops that we love, like wheat. We don't want to live without wheat completely, I suppose. The biggest success, I think, is the rice in a sort of made by the research had been done by University of Yunnan in China in collaboration with the Land Institute. Here I show the result, the yield result in the left diagram. The black is the annual rice, and the red dots, that's the perennial rice. You can see that they are sort of producing more or less on par. But if we look at the right one, we show the high bars. That shows the economic output for the farmers, very similar. But if we look at the net output, we can see the red, which is perennial rice, is more than twice as profitable because it needed so much less labor and other inputs. The performance of Kernza has been a bit of a controversy for some time because there are people who don't like this idea. But we can now, the very latest is that we have seen roughly a 9% increase in yield per breeding cycle. Previously, breeding cycles took 4 or 5 years. Now they take 6 months. Hopefully in the future, they will take even less time. So there is a very rapid increase in the yield of Kernza, but it's still low. It's between 0.5 ton to 1.5 ton per hectare. But let's compare with what happened to wheat. So here I show a diagram from the history of wheat, history of wheat breeding. It starts in the 1850s, and you can see a break in the curve around 1940. 1940, so it's yield of wheat in Kansas. So that break, that was around 1940 when scientifically informed breeding started. And you can see a rapid increase in the yield. How big is that? So from 1940 to 1970, there was roughly a doubling of the wheat yield in Kansas through breeding and improved management. Often we talk about the genetic gain, which is how much is the genetic gain and how much is the management gain. So the genetic gain there is estimated to be about 1%. Not 1% on a sort of interest, but if you sort of divide the doubling over these years, you get to an average of 1% increase. So 9% increase of Kernza is an absolutely phenomenal rate of increase. So there is a very good chance that Kernza will have a yield on par with wheat in less than 20 years from now, far less than 20 years. So this is but then of course, we don't just grow the things on the field. We want somebody to buy it. We want somebody to make something of it. And so we can see how this is now taking off in the US, where we see beer was the first product that sort of commercialized Kernza. We have breakfast cereals, we have pasta, we have bread, and so forth. So what we hope is to follow that trajectory. So by 2040, then we would have more or less changed the cereal production, at least in the United States, hopefully in Europe as well. What is important here is, if we compare the old style of breeding that we have been doing for 10,000 years, that's the left here, traditional breeding. The gray dots, that shows the wild type of genes. The red ones, that unwanted mutations. And the green one is desirable mutations. What is desirable, what is undesirable? So for example, a wild plant really needs to disperse its seeds. It wants to spread the disease. To keep the seeds is a very bad idea for a wild plant. We call it seed shattering. So seed shattering is very damaging if we want to have it for agriculture, but it's, of course, essential for a wild crop. So anti-shattering would be a desirable mutation, and shattering would be an unwanted mutation. But the important here is that the traditional breeding we have been doing for thousands of years, that is for every generation we select and breed new ones, we win something, but we also lose traits. So geneticists say that we have probably lost about 95% of the genetic diversity in our cereals that have been bred for thousands of years, like wheat, barley, oat, and so forth. There's very little left. In Kernza, we have 98% of genetic diversity still there. And if we practice some of the modern breeding technologies, like mutation breeding or genome breeding, we can keep all the diversity and just use the desirable mutations. This is far too complex for me to understand all the details because I'm not a geneticist, but I trust our plant breeders. So what are the possibilities and barriers for a perennial revolution? First of all, the possibilities are, it's so attractive it should be so attractive to farmers. Here are some, this is a Kernza grower in Montana. He has 100 acres of Kernza. And yeah, you can read for yourself what he thinks is the advantages. Fewer tractor passes, less time and stress. I think that time and stress is something that is often underestimated in agriculture economics. It's far too much about numbers on sort of pounds or euros or dollars and hectares. Sort of the stress, the stressful situation of farming, I think, is underestimated. And of course, this speaks for itself. In annual wheat, you have about 35% nitrogen uptake. In perennial Kernza, you have 95% uptake. So much, much less inputs are needed. But there are powerful interests who don't want this to happen, of course. So if your business idea is to manage a problem, you don't want that problem to go away. And especially if your business idea is to manage a problem where the problem becomes worse, the more you manage it. That's a brilliant idea, of course, from a profit-making point of view, like herbicides. This picture shows the phenomenal increase in the number of weeds that have become resistant to glyphosate, because we are using so much glyphosate. And this is sort of an exponential curve, and it's a race we cannot win. Evolution here is always smarter than the agrochemical research or industry. So the solution is not to sell more glyphosate, but have herbicides with 2 active ingredients or 3 active ingredients. I think that the USDA has now, they have definitely licensed the herbicide with a cocktail of 3 active, so glyphosate plus 2 other active ingredients. I think that there is a proposal for a cocktail of 4 active ingredients, and this will just continue. So with perennial cropping systems, we hope that we can be more or less independent of chemical weed management. It's challenging to establish a perennial crop. It's really challenging to avoid the weed problem the first year, but because it's slower than many of the weeds to establish itself. But once it has established itself, it's very efficient in suppressing weeds. And what another, I think, main barrier to this development is what we see here. Some of you might have seen, this is pictures from Phil Howard, an American sociologist who studied the concentration, the economic concentration of the agrochemical industry. What is shown here is in red, we have chemical companies. In blue, we have seed companies. And the text is too small, so nobody can see it. But the red, upper red, that's Bayer. And towards the upper left, with a big cloud around it, that is Monsanto. So Monsanto had been on a very big shopping spree, buying up hundreds of small seed companies, mainly in the US and Canada, sometimes just to close them down, to remove competition. And then more recently, in 2018, they were bought by Bayer, who had been on a shopping spree, mainly in Europe. So something like 70% of the seed industry is now controlled by the chemical industry. And this is I would call it a particular vicious combination. So here are some excerpts from the homepages of these, where they promise solutions to farmers. And they all love this term, integrated solutions. Integrated solutions, that's a euphemism for breeding the new crops so they fit the particular chemicals that they offer. So the best way to sell agrochemicals is to have a control over the plant breeding. This is what, and also they add data sciences. to make farmers more and more dependent on the services. And it's funny how they all, the three big ones, Monsanto, Corteva, and Bayer, they all use almost the same language here. It is one of the most consolidated market we know of. Economists say that when you have a concentration ratio of about 60%, that means that the five biggest companies, they have more than 60% of the market, then it's damaging concentrate. It's oligopoly. In the agrochemicals, it's 75% concentration. It's one of the absolutely most concentrated markets there is. And of course, they will not be passive if suddenly perennial grains start to make inroads into agriculture. They're also extremely influential in setting the politics. Here I'm showing, in the middle here we have the European Union, the different decision-making bodies in the European Union, the Commission, the Parliament and so forth, and then around the cloud of all the chemical industries that are influencing. So in 2 years, in 2019 and 2020, these companies spent 45, almost 50 million euros in lobbying to influence the agricultural politics of the European Union. In their favor, of course. So, but how can we still be optimistic about a perennial future? I think there are three good answers to that. First of all, business as usual is not an option. It's absolutely clear that agriculture needs to change. Many of you probably is part of that change, but unfortunately, you are in a minority in the world. So agriculture at large needs to change. There is a growing awareness of that. Secondly, there is a very strong scientific backing that perennial is the way to go. It's very hard to scientifically argue anything else. Actually, it would be the first time ever that agriculture would change in the direction towards the ecosystem functioning rather than away from it. If we talk about the invention of the moldboard plow in 1860, I think John Deere got the patent in 1865 or something like that. That was a rapid or very significant change away from the ecological functioning of the agriculture. The next one was perhaps the Haber-Bosch invention of Haber-Bosch technology to make nitrogen out of the atmosphere in 1902. That was also a way to distance agriculture from its ecological functioning. And we have the GM revolution, or whatever we call it, of the 1980s, again, moving it away. So this would be the first time agriculture takes a major step towards more of ecosystem functioning. So that's a very strong argument. And thirdly, I haven't met a farmer who wouldn't love having perennials. When they yield sufficiently, it would drastically reduce the management and the cost of inputs. So we are building a global movement. There are now something like 50 research groups around the world on every continent. Yes, every continent, except Antarctica. Our latest advance in experimenting with Kernza is actually, I want to show this, is from the 30th of March in Ukraine. Ludmila here planted Kernza, and then a week later, she had to flee her farm. So we will see what happens when she can come back. In 2019, we had a very, very important meeting in Lund, Sweden, where I come from, where we managed to gather representative all the 50 research groups around the world for the first really global meeting. But we were missing anybody from the UK. So here I am. I want to plant this perennial seed in the UK for research and experimentation with perennial grains. So this is what I hope fields will look like in the future. Here we have a mix of sainfoin, legume, kernza, which is a cereal, alfalfa, which is there just for the nitrogen, and kernza again. And if we are having smart machines, we're making sure that all the different crops mature at the same time, we can easily just harvest multiple crops by just one pass of the combiner. And that's a beautiful future, I hope. So thanks for listening. And we have some time for questions, or do we? How much time do we have for questions? 20 minutes. Good. I see. Wait, there's a microphone coming.
I see that you've got a sort of trademark sign against kernza. Is that the Land Institute's sort of trademark?
Yes.
And is it a viable seed, or is it a sort of sterile seed?
The trademark on kernza is in an attempt to prevent that anybody tries to privatize it. So it's to show that this is not something that, for example, Monsanto, which had a headquarter in the neighboring state, could suddenly claim that they could patent it and do something. So it is only in a way to prevent privatization. I'm not sure it works, but it's an attempt. I think there was another question.
Is it a sterile seed?
No, it's not. It's not a sterile seed. We encourage farmers to collect. But that is important. When you grow kernza, we really, really want you to be part of the growing research community, to report back all the experiences, all the problems, in order to share the information. So the idea is also to build some kind of new social contract between the research and development, the plant breeding, and the growing, because we realize that farmers have enormous expertise in making the seeds better, and also the agroecology, sort of how to grow them. Yes?
He asked the same kind of question, but what else can be done to prevent the likes of Monsanto getting in on this and keeping it as an open source resource for the world?
Yeah, that's the big question that we are sort of discussing all the time. Our latest idea is, would it be wonderful to have some kind of a global community where, now I just take some figures out of the blue, every farmer, not every farmer, but let's say 25% of the farmers in the world would pay $1 per hectare. Every scientist who is part of this non-profit development would pay $10 per publication he or she publishes. That would provide a very, very important source of funding for what we call copyleft research. You all know what copyright is, that you prevent people from copying things. Copyleft is the opposite. It is forbidden to prevent anybody from replicating or using it. So that would be one kind of model that we are thinking of. And if you have any ideas, please send me an email about how we can grow a movement like that. Because it's not really sustainable in long term to ask sort of IT billionaires to open their purse every now and then. It takes too much time also for doing that. Yes? Yes?
Can you hear? There are lots of perennial crops which have been around for a long time. I'm thinking, for example, of nuts.
Yes?
Berries.
Yes?
garlic, and so on.
Yep.
Why have none of them been developed to be a more significant foodstuff?
Yes, of course. I mean, there are many perennial plants out there that we do, but our staple food is to something like 70% based on the annual crops that we grow. I mean, the cereals and the pulses and the oilseed and so forth. So we would like to find perennial alternatives to these crops, because I don't think we can eat only berries and only nuts, even if we should probably eat more of them. But so it's definitely not a substitute to these. And garlic, yes, but we shouldn't eat garlic only, should we? I have a question over there. Okay, yes.
Hello. Well, 2 questions. And how is the pest and disease management of the seeds, and how is the acceptability from the consumer? How does it taste?
I didn't hear that second question.
The acceptance from the consumers about the taste and the products that are made from it.
Yes, okay. Pest management, there is a very active research on this. There is a special section of the Land Institute for sort of both breeding to avoid pests as much as possible, but also how to find sort of breed other crops just for the sake of preventing pests on the desirable crops and so forth. So, and so far, we haven't had much problems of pests except perennial sorghum in Uganda. That was, yeah. So it is an ongoing question, but there are ecological good reasons why we should have less problems of pests in perennials than in the current one. And finally, of course, it's extremely important, how does it taste? And what is the nutritional value of this? The nutritional value of Kernza that we know most of, it's sort of much superior to wheat, for example. Wheat is sort of a close relative, I'll say a distant relative. But it's superior in terms of protein content and minerals and vitamins and so forth. If you read George Monbiot's book, he describes how he was baking with it. First, he was very skeptical about it, but then when he felt sort of, when he tasted the flavor, he was just, yeah. It's good. I have baked with it a lot as well, and it's very nice. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful talk. You've just answered my question. So your talk was mainly about solving the farming problem and the cost of inputs and so on and perennial. And my question was about, and I'm a novice in this arena, but I was thinking about the root systems and presumably, or I'm feeling that if the root systems are going deeper with perennials, then they're taking up the micronutrients that we need. And have you seen the studies, and is it another problem that we solve, is that the nutrient value of these perennials is solving another problem for humankind?
Yes. Can I get the first slide back? There is an amazing setup of technologies behind it. Oh, right, here it comes. So roots, maybe we should take a look at this. Towards the, at the left side, you see the root system of Kernza. So there you see it's not just this, the tube-formed root that I showed here, but it's actually spreading out. And on the right side, you have wheat, very, very shallow and thin root system. So of course, there are different things that can be utilized with that root system. I'm not an expert, but one thing at least which we are very much aware of, that is the ability to pick up and making use of phosphorus stored very deep into the soil. And we have, in most agricultural soils in Europe where we have been farming for a long time, we have lots and lots of phosphorus in the soil, but it's inaccessible for our plants. So there are some studies that show that there might be phosphorus up to 300 harvests in the soil if we could just make it available to the plants. It's too deep for the annual ones, and also the most natural plants, they are using mycorrhiza or other sort of fungus to help them. But our conventional plants, we have bred them for so long, and we have treated them so nicely, so they don't know how to live in symbiosis with mycorrhiza any longer. So there is a genetic barrier to actually have this symbiosis with microbiota, which we can now, when we sort of domesticate wild plants, we can make sure that we keep these abilities. So there is an untapped resource of doing this, yes. Yes.
Some of the early research on perennial cereals found that the yield declined in subsequent years and got to a point where you didn't really get an economic yield. In the perennial cereals you're developing, are you finding that similar trait? You know, will you have to renew this, say, every 5 years or every 10 years? And what do you think the kind of the physiological boundary from the plant's perspective is in terms of pushing that longer?
Yes, that's a very, very good question, Claude. So what we have seen is that Kernza, after some years, it starts to compete with itself. It becomes very, very thick, very dense, and it starts to compete with itself and reduce the kernel yield. That has been a serious problem. A solution that seems to be working, that is to have a little device that cuts the meristem, so the zones where the plant is shooting again every year. That is located about an inch below the soil surface. So having a little sort of a knife mounted on a tractor that cuts strips, take off half the number of plants, basically, as strips, to rejuvenate the cultivation. Then, so you reduce the competition between plants, and then the Kernza starts to produce seeds again. So there are lots of research questions remaining of this kind. So I hope I don't give the impression that this is just a seed that you can get from a seed shop and start producing immediately. It's still an ongoing, but so yes. And perenniality, the oldest still sort of growing perennial Kernza fields, they are about 12 years now. But we're probably looking at something like 5-6 years, and then it would probably be good or advisable to change. Perhaps there is a new breeding cycle that is better than the other ones, and to rejuvenate, but not plowing, but cutting the meristems an inch below the soil surface, and then planting again. Yes?
What was wheatgrass used for? You talked about wheatgrass as well.
Yes, the intermediate wheatgrass, which is Kernza is sort of the name given to the domesticated version of intermediate wheatgrass. And intermediate wheatgrass is actually, it originates from the Fertile Crescent, just like most of our cereals. But it was brought to the prairie in the US in already 1930s as a very protein-rich forage crop. And then in 1980, West Jackson started to look for candidates in the prairie that could be domesticated, and they found this one that had spread, thrived in the prairie, and ironically, it was actually from the Fertile Crescent. But it was a perennial one. Yes?
Going back to the root structure of Kernza, have you had any problems with it on drained land? Root systems finding their way into drains and blocking drains? I mean, it's a problem in an area where I come from for rape to do so, and looking at the root structure of that, I think it might be a big problem. Is it all on free drained land?
Yep. This is exactly the same concern that was raised by the biggest cultivation of Kernza we have in Sweden, which is 60 hectares. That was their concern. What will happen to the drainage system? And in some fields, they found out that, I mean, in a way, it clogged the grids. But then on the other hand, they said that it changes the hydrology of the field, so you don't need the drainage any longer. So it's still sort of very much in sort of a research question that cannot be solved in the labs. It needs to be solved in the fields with the farmers, with the machinery and equipment, and all the experience of the farmers. And I'm sure there is a possibility of finding good solutions for sort of fields that have been drained like this. Yep.
So thank you very much. I think it's related to the previous question that if you have these non-free draining soils, if you have an elevated water table, does it even make sense to have such deep roots as the Kernza is capable of producing if they are kind of shocked by the elevated groundwater table during the winter anyway, which is it's a big thing here in Northern Europe that you have excessive amounts of water during the winter?
So you suggest there is a risk of having too much roots?
Yeah, yes, actually. So your plant invests a lot of energy into maintaining and building a big root system. Is it any good if it's anyway cut off by the water during winter?
Yeah.
If it is.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I mean, if we, no, I think I know what you are getting at. An objection against the whole idea of perennial grain crops has been the so-called trade-off theory, that a plant cannot both have big seeds and big roots, or being both sort of big seed producers and perennial. That is a theory which has been around for a long time, at least since the 1930s. But I would say that it's to some extent flawed, because it thinks about the trade-off between we call it the Y model, one or the other. Of course, there are lots of trade-offs. You can't have big seeds that are dispersed over large distances. That's sort of an obvious trade-off. But so the question might be that, is it in order to increase the yield of the seed yield, do we have to reduce the energy consumption for the roots? I don't think so, because the more roots you have, the more biomass you can produce. I mean, one obvious thing in our environment is, of course, that the perennial plants will photosynthesize 12 months per year. Maybe in the midst of the winter, there might not be much photosynthesis, but it will go all through November, early December, and start again 1st of February, while our annual crops, they have a much shorter period of photosynthesis. So there is a bigger resource in terms of energy to take. And once having, I mean, it's quite clear that in the beginning of this, much of the energy goes to producing roots. But once the roots have been established, it takes less energy to maintain the root system and to build a new one. So I don't think that there is any sort of trade-off between a big root system and a big yield. Yes? I have a question here, or we have a microphone. Oh, yep. I have a microphone first.
I was just wondering about the climate that Kernza grows in, if it's comparable to wheat.
Pardon, on climate?
The climate that Kernza grows in, is it comparable to wheat?
Probably. But as I say, if something can survive Kansas, it can probably survive anywhere. They have worse winters than we have, and they have worse summers than we have. But sort of a rule of thumb is that where you can grow wheat, you can probably grow Kernza. So I don't think it is, at least the current versions, is not something for the humid tropics yet. Perhaps the highlands of East Africa, for example, or Ethiopia would be a fantastic crop in Ethiopia, I would guess, because it would probably produce less, sort of more than their favorite teff, and it would prevent erosion in the mountainous regions of Ethiopia. But basically, it's similar to wheat when it comes to its... But one of our research projects is to establish test cultivations from the Mediterranean all the way to the polar circle in Sweden. So from southern France to northern Sweden, in order to test the climate resilience in all these places. Where is the microphone? Okay.
I don't know if it's...
Yep.
Yeah, that was my question. I just wondered how it was performing in places with 400, like less than 430 millimeters annual rainfall. I guess you just answered it.
Yes, that sounds pretty arid. Yeah. There's a question over here.
Yeah, this is going to have to be the last question. So.
Okay.
Yep.
You get the last question.
Does it have a preferred soil type? My gut feeling is it prefers lighter soils. I'm on heavy clay. And have you trial results relative to wheat or whatever on various soil types, and what were they?
Yes, this is, of course, an extremely important question. And the answer is that we don't really know yet. It is grown under, I think it's about 4,000 acres in the US, many different places. It's grown on 100 hectares totally in Sweden, a few places in France. So we haven't really tested, but there is, so this is a part of the ongoing research to test it in every possible soil type we know. But sandy soils are challenging like they are with all cereals, that's for sure.
Well, Lennart, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks.